Hello, and thanks for joining us this week on Friday Formula, a weekly motorsport podcast, where this week we're preparing to strap on a fresh pair of slicks and head out onto the Variante Bassa to tackle the Temple of Speed at Imola. I'm Owen Bellwood, and once again I'm joined by Will Longman. How are you doing this week, Will?
Not too bad, not too bad. It feels like forever ago since we last had a race, but it's only the second Grand Prix of the season. And I'm hoping it lives up to expectations. How about you?
Yeah, kind of feeling the same. It feels like the 3-week break in between Bahrain and Imola has been longer than the winter break. But the race in Bahrain gave us a lot of excitement. So I think the anticipation is sky high ahead of this week.
Yeah, especially given that Imola gave us such a good race last year. It's hard to believe that it dropped off the calendar at all. But that's what we're talking about this week. We're talking all about Imola and the fact that it is a classic track. It has a lot of history, which you're going to be delving into. And I'm going to be looking at some specific races. But it did drop off the calendar. So any of the new fans, which I know in last week's episode we kind of talked about when we became F1 fans, which was kind of the mid-noughties or late noughties, your early 10s, I think your first race was, probably never seen a race at Imola. I hadn't until 2020.
No, I was the same. Watching last year was the first full race I'd seen there. So we both kind of agreed that this would be a really good opportunity to find out a little bit more about what's made this circuit so special over the years.
I'm interested because I've focused on specifically the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, which, pretty obvious reasons, which, if you don't know, will become apparent later. But I've purposely not really looked at anything prior to that because, Owen, that was your domain. I had one race to look at and you had the rest of time. So why don't you kick us off and start from the beginning?
Yeah, so as we mentioned today, the cars are going to hit the track in Imola in Italy for the 2021 Formula One Pirelli Gran Premio del Made in Italy del Emily Formula One Pirelli Gran Premio del Made in Italy del Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, which is not what it's always been known as. So the race this is going to be the 28th race at this circuit that has been an official Formula One event, but the circuit itself is known as the Autodromo Internazionale Enzo e Dino Ferrari, and it's obviously gets its name from Enzo Ferrari, who founded Scuderia Ferrari, and then his son Dino, who sadly died in 1956 of leukemia. So that's where the name of the circuit itself comes from. It's had quite a long history that's sort of seen it go through a few different guises. So when it was first developed as a racetrack, it was actually a temporary site, and that was in 1953 when the foundations for the circuit were initially laid, and areas of it were permanent racetrack, and then other areas were bits that were added in when it was needed for events. It was quite different to what we see today. It was still very high speed, but it didn't have a lot of the chicanes that we see on today's layout. So it's a little bit shorter, still quite fast, but obviously not to the same regards as it is now, as it was a semi-permanent track. But that was back in 1953, and it didn't host Formula One cars until 1963. So it had undergone its own evolution and development up to that. The first Formula One cars to hit the track were part of a non-championship event. So we're still a few years off a proper race, but that was won by Jim Clark with Lotus. The first championship event didn't come until 1980, when Imola stood in for the Italian Grand Prix, which, as we're all very familiar with, is usually held at Monza, which Will is convinced looks like a swan for some reason.
Looks like a swan. It looks like a swan. Oh. Monza. Flip it. Rotate it. Swan.
Just hold it up a bit. Like lift it up a little bit. don't I don't see it.
There's the beak. There's like its eye. There's its neck.
I'd more say pelican.
Whether it looks like a pelican or a swan, there is simply something going on with Italian racetracks looking like birds because Imola looks like a duck.
Yes, Imola does 100% look like a duck.
Thank you.
So 1980 was the first time that it hosted a Formula One race, and that was the Italian Grand Prix. The race was quite an interesting one. It was won by Nelson Piquet, who was driving a Brabham Ford at the time, and it was his third win of the season and his second win in succession. So it was quite a tight moment for the title battle, as it then gave him the lead in the championship. I think everyone went home halfway through. They didn't. That's not true. But the race proved to be a really exciting spectacle, and teams were quite eager to go back to the track because it had offered a pretty exciting race the year before. But it went under a name change for the first time, and in 1981 it became the San Marino Grand Prix for the first time. The track itself isn't in San Marino, which is a nearby state in Italy, but it has taken the name San Marino Grand Prix for pretty much every single one of its runnings, apart from 2 so far and a third this year.
What's super interesting is that there must have been this obsession when F1 was in its, not infancy, but like the 80s and 90s, I don't know. There was this obsession with F1 when it was in this kind of bubbling up phase, I don't know, as it was gaining popularity in the mainstream about being a world championship. Every Grand Prix has to be named after a country. And they picked San Marino. I mean, San Marino was like the second smallest country in the world, or third, I think, after like the Vatican City and Monaco. Like you say, Imola isn't in San Marino. It doesn't actually have like anything to do with it. But now it's happily the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. They don't mind saying that.
That's not the full name.
Sorry, please correct me.
The Made in Italy del Emilia Romagna Grand Prix 2021.
I do apologise. I won't be so disrespectful to this race again.
The inaugural San Marino race was another quite memorable one. Only 14 cars started the race that year. There was a protest around the running of the event, so there were quite a few sitting this one out. And then during the race, the Renaults of Alain Prost and René Arnoux actually retired, which left Ferrari to pretty much run away with the lead, which you think is going to be boring. But then there was drama with team orders, even back in the 80s. And what happened was the two Ferraris of Villeneuve and Pironi were way off ahead, so the team asked them to slow down to try and save fuel and prevent a risk of any mechanical failures, so that they would hold on to that 1-2 and definitely get the win. But as they slowed down, Villeneuve thought this meant that the cars would maintain position and wouldn't be racing, but Pironi didn't agree and overtook him. And then Villeneuve overtook Pironi, and then it came up to the last lap when they'd been sort of overtaking each other a few times, and Pironi actually did take the lead in the end, cross the line and win, which Villeneuve was not happy about. And following the race, he's quoted as saying, "I'll never speak to Pironi again in my life."
That's mad.
Yeah, that's a big dramatic end to the start.
I know this is the 80s, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did they have team radio that functioned like team radio does now back then? Or were they being communicated with by the pit board?
I'm not sure, actually. I imagine it would have still had some form of radio. Maybe just have been like one-to-one rather than multi-channel.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess that would have been one of the first instances of team orders or a drama from it.
Yeah, I found it really interesting that team orders and people disagreeing over them has been part of the sport for so long. It's such a tradition. So it had quite a dramatic start as the San Marino event, and the San Marino Grand Prix stayed on the calendar until 2006. So it was a relatively long held event, which is probably why so many people think of it so fondly, and it's got all this association with such close racing. Over the years, there's been a few slightly dominant names. Michael Schumacher has the record for the most wins, and he's won at Imola 7 times in total. And then behind him, Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost have both won 3 times, and Damon Hill and Nigel Mansell both won the event twice. In terms of constructors, after winning the first San Marino Grand Prix, Ferrari then went on to win another 7 more, so they have 8 wins at Imola, and they're tied with Williams. They are joint to be the most successful. So whichever one wins this weekend, out of those 2, could clinch the title.
I don't know who I'd put my money on.
Yeah, I could. If you asked me to pick between them 2 to win, I'm not sure which one I'd go for. So while the circuit has been on the calendar since 1982 to 2006, solidly, it has undergone quite a few changes. It was such a fast track, so to try and combat that and reduce the speeds that the cars were running at, a few changes were made, such as extra chicanes to try and slow the cars down. And that means that over the years, the length of the track has got a little bit longer, and it is now home to 19 corners in total, which is quite a nice number for a racetrack. And they are 10 right-handers and 9 left-handers. So that's what the drivers will be up against this weekend. The changes were sort of brought about because of quite a few dramatic crashes on the circuit, purely because drivers were going so fast into the corners and there wasn't quite as much runoff as we'd maybe be used to in a modern racetrack. So in 1987, Nelson Piquet crashed quite heavily during practice. There was a tyre failure and he then missed the race due to injury. And then in the 1989 San Marino Grand Prix, Gerhard Berger crashed his Ferrari at Tamburello after his front wing failed. So because of events like this, they did feel inclined to try and slow the track down a little bit. But probably the most well-known changes that were made to the circuit came about following the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, which is an event that, Will, you have been finding out a little bit more about.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, before we get into it, kind of reflecting on when you started, you were talking about it being a temporary circuit in the 1950s, and it was a fast circuit, and you know, back then the cars were nowhere near as fast as they were even in the 90s, and to think of the gulf in technology between kind of the 1950s, when you have this really, it would have been a high-speed circuit at the time because it has these kind of long straights and kind of it's a lot of kinks, wasn't it, with some,
yeah,
it's what gives it its duck layout. You have a couple of kinks and then a couple of kind of right-angled turns that come back, and the cars probably could have taken it then because they didn't reach the monumental speeds they were reaching in the 1990s.
No, and the interesting thing I found was that the fastest lap during the 1980 Italian Grand Prix during the race was Alan Jones, and that was a 1:36. And then if you compare that to the fastest lap during the race from last year, that was a 1:15.4. So it's 15 seconds in all of those years, which sounds like a lot when you put it down, but that, I feel like that just shows how quick they must have been already.
But that's also, what year was yours from?
So that was 1980, was the 1:36.0.
So that doesn't include the changes to slow the cars down,
yeah,
that came in after the 1994 race.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think, so the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, I guess we'll kick into it.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason motorsport is thrilling is because it's dangerous, right? And it's the reason that we look up to drivers as being superhuman and super brave. And it's because of weekends like this. It was probably one of the worst periods in modern Formula One. Most people know it's the race that we lost Ayrton Senna, but it's often forgotten that Roland Ratzenberger died the day before. You have a double tragedy at this circuit. But I wanted to start kind of focusing on Ratzenberger and giving him the kind of same amount of airtime as we give Senna, because it was Ratzenberger's first season in Formula One. So who knows what he could have gone on to achieve? But it was qualifying as well. So he was coming out of this Villeneuve kink, as we were talking about. The straight's kind of had these little kinks in, and he completely lost control of his Simtech and whacked into a concrete barrier. And like, these concrete barriers are very close to the circuit, so you lose any kind of downforce and can't move around those kinks, you're going to completely just smack into it. And that's what happened. He'd run over a curb early in his lap, and picked up some front wing damage, which, when you're travelling at 315 kilometres an hour, which is what he was, like, it makes it so hard to turn that car. So it's almost 200 miles an hour that he hammered into this concrete wall. Like, horrible event. He was airlifted to hospital, but he suffered a basal skull fracture, and was kind of, I think he was pronounced dead while the qualifying session was still going on, which is also insane that the session even restarted, let alone the race went ahead the next day. It was kind of the show must go on attitude that showbiz has, is what Formula One always had back in the day. No matter what happened, the race kind of had to happen, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's a very stoic attitude to have, I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of a similar thing to what we saw with Romain Grosjean's crash at Bahrain last year. There did seem to be that mentality that, yes, he's had this horrific accident, we've seen him get out of the car, but we need to get back to it and carry on, which was quite jarring to watch. These
drivers know they're going in to sit surrounded by fuel and drive at 300 kilometers an hour. They know it's risky, and if something happens and someone's okay, then I think the expectation is, you know what you're getting yourself in for, and it's all okay. That, literally no one died. In Grosjean's case. In the San Marino case, it was slightly different, unfortunately. So the race got underway on the Sunday in the afternoon. Senna was on pole from Schumacher, even though he declined to set a time in the second qualifying session. And there was an early crash in the race itself. Pedro Lamy smacked into JJ Leto's stalled Benetton on the grid, which wasn't a great start. It brought out the safety car. And again, this was the third safety car in 2 years, because they'd only bought the safety car back the year before. Okay. Which is a bit mad. Wait till I tell you what the safety car was, because we currently have a Mercedes-Benz and an Aston Martin, and everyone's very excited about the Aston Martin. It was a Vauxhall Vectra. Which is mad. And quite rightly, a lot of the drivers were complaining they couldn't keep the temperature in their tyres behind this Vectra.
God, imagine if it was an Astra, because that's probably the current equivalent. Imagine if they rocked up in this weekend with a new one.
Exactly.
I don't think anyone would be happy about that.
But unfortunately, kind of the drivers' worries were founded to be warranted when Senna was battling Schumacher, and I think it was only the second racing lap. It was the 7th lap and kind of the first high-speed left-hander. Senna just couldn't get his car turned around, again, one of these kind of small kinks. And he was going at 305 kilometers an hour, just couldn't get it, pretty much went straight on into a concrete barrier, which when he made an impact with it, it was 211 kilometers an hour. He was killed pretty much instantly. It does get worse, and I wanted to highlight something again to prove how far we've come. So there were marshals on the track, there are ambulances on the track, there is a driver having medical treatment given to him, there is literally a helicopter on the circuit when Eric Comas was released from the pits to rejoin the circuit.
That just
How mental. It's a red flag. He came in to get some damage, and the team, there was a mix-up and somehow he was let to go around a lap. Like, it is insane.
Yeah, that just shows how far the sport has come just in terms of organisation and safety and just staying on top of everything that's going on. It seems completely bonkers.
I wanted to move on a bit because that was the horrific tragedy of the San Marino race, and it goes to prove that when we talk about the driver's bravery, it does mean something. It isn't a kind of flippant comment about, it's not marketing about Formula One. That can often get forgotten, given that as we did move on, safety did get better, but not straight away. So the following race was in Monaco, and it was Thursday practice, and Carl Wendlinger had a crash at the Nouvelle chicane, and that put him in a coma for 2 weeks. So on the Friday, the GPDA got together in a hotel, and this was kind of what's going wrong. Because at this point, right, the last 4 official Formula One sessions went like this. Friday qualifying at Imola, Rubens Barrichello had a crash that launched him over barriers, and his car was upside down. I didn't even mention that. The fact that doesn't even get into this lecture about safety in Formula One is mad. Yeah. Qualifying 2 on Saturday was when Ratzenberger lost his life. Sunday in the race, Senna lost his life, and then the very next session, Thursday practice at Monaco, we have a driver in a coma. It's mental. It's absolutely mental. When you kind of think, why would you get into a car knowing that yours could be the next one to end up in a heap?
Yeah, it's insane when you think about the frequency of accidents like that and things. Like today, they're freak accidents when they happen, when you see someone that appears to be more at risk. And just for it to be every other race, something like that to be happening, just why would people do it?
No, it's absolutely mad. So there was this big thing on the Friday, because obviously the Friday at Monaco, they get the day off. And they had a lot of drivers come in and give them advice. They kind of hammered out over some hours what they wanted. Niki Lauda turned up and kind of gave them advice. Obviously, he had been involved in a massive accident in the history of Formula One. And they decided kind of Martin Brundle became the chairman and a bit of a bastion for safety in Formula One, with Gerhard Berger and Michael Schumacher staying as the officers, as you were. And they just wanted a say in safety decisions. They wanted the ability to inspect the circuits, and they didn't trust the hands that they were putting their lives in anymore. They wanted to kind of take that back a little bit. And the race in Monaco went off without a hitch, which is nice to know. Even nicer touch, Schumacher won, Brundle came second, Berger came third.
Oh,
lovely bit of PR. Yeah. But one thing I wanted to talk about these particular crashes was the broadcasting of them. Because we went to university and we studied television. I think we're probably quite keen about talking about television in general. So I think it deserves a mention, because when Grosjean had his crash in Bahrain, we didn't see anything until we knew he was fine. They were very clear, and it wasn't just him either. They said, we're checking that the marshals are okay because the tyre flew off, and they didn't show anything. And that was a little bit worrying. But at least they didn't show us a flaming wreckage waiting for something to happen.
Yeah.
Daniel Ricciardo wasn't too happy. I'm not sure I agree with his grievances so much. I think, again, like we were saying, if you know everyone involved is okay, then it kind of proves that the safety works. It proves that the suits work. It proves that the safety cell, the halo, the barriers all came together. Isn't that fine?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you'd seen Daniel Ricciardo's comments this week about Formula One's coverage on social media and how they put together a top 10 moments of 2020. And I think he claimed that 8 of them were crashes.
Yeah.
And he's come out and said that it's disgusting that the governing body of the sport is promoting crashes as being the most exciting parts of the year. Which I feel like, on the one hand, I kind of agree with. A crash isn't something anyone wants to see. Like, no one signs up to watch a race in the hope that someone has a horrific accident. So it's strange that they've become so integral.
Yeah, and that's what I think the sport has to be careful of, as it's attracting its new audience with Drive to Survive, because they're kind of dramatising and romanticising these elements of the sport, which are, they are undoubtedly an element of the sport.
Yeah.
You can't kind of get away from that. So I think they have to include some bits of it. If there's a battle going on for an overtake and that ends up in a crash, then yeah, I wouldn't mind that ending up in the top 10 moments. But it's not the sport, is it? I don't think you'd have a top 10 moments of the football season and 8 of them would be horrific injuries or bad tackles. It would be goals and skills and stuff. And that's what you want the sport to be known for, or at least you'd hope so. So I agree with him in that sense. I don't agree with him about the live coverage of the actual race.
No, yeah, it's quite different because he wasn't happy about the live coverage either. But I think I agree with him more on the social media side, how in the aftermath you've had the time to think about it and why are those still the moments you're picking.
Yeah.
But how we obviously didn't have social media in the 90s. How did the coverage differ back then?
It was, I don't say this lightly, bloody awful. So the morals and the precedents are just completely different. So Ratzenberger had his crash, and we're looking at close-ups of his head rocking around in the cockpit. And at one point, there is a helicopter shot of the medics performing CPR and chest compressions.
That is not
on live broadcast. For Senna's crash, RAI, who were the Italian broadcast, the host broadcaster, they were showing close-ups of them dragging his body out of the cockpit and kind of it lying there motionless and trying to get in as close as possible. The BBC kind of pulled that. They thought it was too insensitive to show it. So they had like their own camera in the pit lane, but Murray Walker was still watching the pictures, and you can only describe what you can see, right? And he was finding that quite upsetting. But the very fact that in Italy it was going out live, uncensored as is,
that just seems so completely polar opposites to where we would be today.
completely awful. But I mean, it is one race weekend, which I think it proves that, like, even if you did see it live on TV or you didn't, the events of it shouldn't be forgotten. I know people say, oh yeah, it's a weekend better to forget, but I don't think it is. I think this is one that you have to learn from. Senna was the last F1 driver to pass away during a race until Jules Bianchi. So that's 20 years between those two dying. But he was the first F1 driver to die in a day, like literally a 24-hour period.
It's interesting that you say this is an event that we should learn from. From looking back on it, it's quite clear that the sport really has learned from it. For a start, it made changes to the circuit to slow it down, and then it made changes to the safety cell in the car and the protective suits that people were wearing, up until the point when we obviously had the tragic accident with Jules, and then the sport learned from that as well, and things like the halo that were brought in after that has been credited with saving Romain Grosjean's life. So these events obviously are tragic, but it's quite sort of not comforting, but it's good to see that changes are being made and that the sport will only continue to get safer as we go forwards. Like even off the back of Grosjean's crash, they've said that changes might be made to the fuel tanks and things to make them more secure if something similar happens again.
And I'm going to try and pick up the tone now, because I realise that my section of this is going to be, or has been, god-awful depressing. But Imola is a very important race, and I hope that we have conveyed that, and that we don't forget that going into this weekend's race, which will be a delight. Who have you got for pole on Saturday, and what's your 1, 2, 3 on Sunday?
So I had a quick look at last year's results when Valtteri Bottas was pole, Hamilton won, Bottas was second, and Ricciardo was third. So it was quite an exciting race. I'm going to say this year it will be Max on pole, And then my podium, Max, Checo, Norris.
Oh.
Yeah.
That is out there. So, Mercedes having an awful weekend.
Not awful, but just not to plan.
Okay, well, I'm going to agree with Max getting pole and Max getting P1 because he went very well in Imola last year and he suffered a tyre blowout, didn't he?
Yeah.
Which he didn't have much luck in some of those races in Italy. But yeah,
I think
I'll
in
agree
all
with you on
three
that.
races in Italy, he had a shocking weekend.
Yeah. I was trying to remember what happened to him in Monza, but I think he just retired, didn't he? He was involved in the lap 1 crash at Mugello, and I think he just retired with issues in Monza.
Yeah, I think so as well.
Unless...
power unit issues or something.
Yeah. So I'm going him, Pete, for pole, and I think he'll get the win. I think Hamilton will be second. And I think I agree with you. I think Checo will be third. I think it's a high-speed circuit, which is going to benefit the Red Bulls. But I still think Hamilton is going to... Because it's quite a narrow circuit, I think he's going to have the skill to defend. I think Max will run away with it, and there might be a bit of a battle for second, third, fourth between the other three cars.
But Lewis is quite a fair defender. So I think if he can hold on to second, he'll probably stay there. But he's not because Sergio Perez is coming second. So.
Well, this is a good time to plug our fantasy league. If you are on the F1 fantasy game, we have our own league. At the moment, it's just the two of us. So
it's not actually. We've got 3 people in it.
Shout
out to Simon James.
3's a crowd. Come and join us.
The link to join, the code to join the league will be in the description. So if you just log on to your Fantasy Formula 1 team, there's a join league box, and if you enter our code, you'll be able to see how your team compares to ours.
That is everything for this week. Thank you for joining us. An update, we are also now on Twitter, so you can go and follow us then and get a notification every time we post a video. Or if you're on the move and can't watch us on YouTube and see our wonderful faces, and fancy listening to the podcast, which is often a fuller version of what you see here, head over to everywhere you get our podcasts. But in the meantime, give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment with who you think is going to win this weekend's race, and then we'll revisit it next week and see who was right with our predictions. Obviously, we both know that Max Verstappen is going to win. It's just those second and third positions. So we'll be reviewing the race next week. Make sure you subscribe to get that in your inbox, and we'll see you then. Enjoy the race. Bye.